Chapter 2 Treasures in the Earth. The road that led Joseph Smith into the career of prophet, seer, and revelator is overgrown with a tangle of legend and contradiction. Mormon and non-Mormon accounts seem to conflict at every turn. The earliest non-Mormon documents that mention him at all, an early court record and newspaper accounts, indicate that Joseph reflected the religious independence of his father. The haranguing of the revivalist preacher seems to have filled him only with contempt. But these documents contrast remarkably with Joseph's official biography, begun many years later when he was near the summit of his career. The latter tells the story of a visionary boy caught by revival hysteria and channeled into a life of mysticism and exhortation. The evidence, however, leaves no doubt that, whatever Joseph's inner feelings, his reputation before he organized his church was not that of an adolescent mystic brooding over visions, but of a likable ne'er-do-well who is notorious for tall tales and necromantic arts, and who spent his leisure leading a band of idlers and digging for buried treasure. This behavior is confirmed by the most coldly objective description of young Joseph that remains, which historians have hitherto overlooked or ignored. This description seems also to be the earliest public document that mentions him at all. The document, a court record dated March 1826, when Joseph was 21, covers his trial in Bainbridge, New York, on a charge of being a disorderly person and an impostor. On the basis of the testimony presented, including Joseph's own admissions of indulging in magic arts and organizing hunts for buried gold, the court ruled him guilty of disturbing the peace. 4 years after this trial, Joseph's Book of Mormon appeared, whereupon the local editors in Palmyra, who had never previously considered him worthy of comment, began to explore the vagaries of his youth. The editor of the Palmyra Reflector, Abner Cole, under the pseudonym Obadiah Dogberry, wrote during 1830 and 1831 a series of articles describing in exuberant detail Joseph's adolescent years. Later, in 1833, when Joseph's church was rapidly gaining in notoriety and power, a disgruntled ex-Mormon named Hurlbut went about Palmyra and Manchester soliciting affidavits from more than 100 persons who had known Joseph before he began his religious career. These sworn testimonies, which were published in 1834 by Eber D. Howe in a vitriolic anti-Mormon book called Mormonism Unveiled, may have been colored by the bias of the man who collected them, but they corroborated and supplemented the court record and Dogberry's editorials. Since the story that they relate of Joseph Smith's adolescent years is further substantiated by certain admissions in his own autobiography and in the naive biography dictated by his mother, it is possible to reconstruct Joseph's youth with a fair degree of accuracy. Significantly, Joseph Smith's first sketch of his early years took the form of an apology for his youthful indiscretions. Shortly after Mormonism Unveiled appeared, he wrote a reply for his church newspaper. At the age of 10, my father's family removed to Palmyra, New York, where, and in the vicinity of which, I lived, or made it my place of residence until I was 21, the latter part in the town of Manchester. During this time, as is common to most or all youths, I fell into many vices and follies, but as my accusers are, and have been forward to accuse me of being guilty of gross and outrageous violations of the peace and good order of the community, I take the occasion to remark that, though, as I have said above, as is common to most or all youths, I fell into many vices and follies, I have not, neither can it be sustained in truth, been guilty of wronging or injuring any man or society of men, and those imperfections to which I allude, and for which I have often had occasion to lament, were a light, and too often vain mind, exhibiting a foolish and trifling conversation. Although 51 of Joseph's neighbors signed an affidavit accusing him of being destitute of moral character and addicted to vicious habits, there is no evidence that viciousness was a part of his nature, and his apology can be accepted at full value. Actually, he was a gregarious, cheerful, imaginative youth, born to leadership but hampered by meager education and grinding poverty. A landlord class was battening on his labor, driving westward helplessly ensnared families like his own. In the Palmyra newspaper, he could read of their mortgage sales, 6 to 10 every week on the front page. He lived far enough east to see opulence and parade, and not far enough west to escape a crushing burden of debt. His family, having slipped downhill since those early years when his mother's dowry had been the envy of the neighborhood, had lost security and respectability. But the need for deference was strong with him. Talented far beyond his brothers or friends, he was impatient with their modest hopes and humdrum fancies. Nimble-witted, ambitious, and gifted with a boundless imagination, he dreamed of escape into an illustrious and affluent future. For Joseph was not meant to be a plodding farmer tied to the earth by habit or by love for the recurrent miracle of harvest. He detested the plow as only a farmer's son can, and looked with despair on the fearful mortgage that clouded their future. There is, of course, a gold mine or a buried treasure on every mortgaged homestead. Whether the farmer ever digs for it or not, it is there, haunting his daydreams when the burden of debt is most unbearable. New England was full of treasure hunters, poor, desperate farmers who, having unwittingly purchased acres of rocks, looked to those same rocks to yield up golden recompense for their back-breaking toil. "We could name, if we pleased," said one Vermont weekly, "at least 500 respectable men who do in the simplicity and sincerity of their hearts believe that immense treasures lie concealed upon our green mountains, many of whom have been for a number of years industriously and perseveringly engaged in digging it up." When these men migrated west, they brought with them the whole folklore of the money digger, the spells and incantations, the witch hazel stick and mineral rod. But where the Green Mountains yielded nothing but an occasional cache of counterfeit money, western New York and Ohio were rich in Indian relics. Hundreds of burial mounds dotted the landscape, filled with skeletons and artifacts of stone, copper, and sometimes beaten silver. There were 8 such tumuli within 12 miles of the Smith farm. It would have been a jaded curiosity indeed that would have kept any of these boys in the family from spading at least once into their pitted surfaces, and even the father succumbed to the local enthusiasm and tried his hand with a witch hazel stick. Young Joseph could not keep away from them. Excitement over the possibilities of Indian treasure and perhaps buried Spanish gold reached its height in Palmyra with the coming of what the editor of the Palmyra Reflector called a vagabond fortune-teller named Walters, who so won the confidence of several farmers that for some months they paid him $3 a day to hunt for buried money on their property. In addition to crystals, stuffed toads, and mineral rods, the squire's usual paraphernalia, Walters claimed to have found an ancient Indian record that described the locations of their hidden treasure. This he would read aloud to his followers in what seemed to be a strange and exotic tongue, but was actually, the newspaper editor declared, an old Latin version of Caesar's orations. The press accounts describing Walter's activity, published in 1830 to 1831, stated significantly that when he left the neighborhood, his mantle fell upon young Joseph Smith. Joseph's neighbors later poured out tales of seer stones, ghosts, magic incantations, and nocturnal excavations. Joseph Capron swore that young Joseph had told him a chest of gold watches was buried on his property, and had given orders to his followers to stick a parcel of large stakes in the ground, several rods around in a circular form, directly over the spot. One of the group then marched around the circle with a drawn sword to guard any assault which his satanic majesty might be disposed to make, and the others dug furiously but futilely for the treasure. Another neighbor, William Stafford, swore that Joseph told him there was buried money on his property, but that it could not be secured until a black sheep was taken to the spot, and led around a circle bleeding with its throat cut. This ritual was necessary to appease the evil spirit guarding the treasure. "To gratify my curiosity," Stafford admitted, "I let them have a large fat sheep. They afterwards informed me that the sheep was killed pursuant to commandment, but as there was some mistake in the process, it did not have the desired effect. This, I believe, is the only time they ever did make money digging a profitable business." Joseph's money digging began in earnest with his discovery of a seer stone when he was digging a well for Mason Chase. Martin Harris stated that it came from 24 feet underground, and Joseph Capron tested that Joseph could see wondrous sights in it: ghosts, infernal spirits, mountains of gold and silver. Joseph's wife once described this stone as not exactly black, but rather dark in color, though she admitted to none of the early uses to which it was put. In later years, Joseph was frankly admitted in his church newspaper and also in his journal that he had been a money digger, although he wrote, it was not particularly profitable, as he got only $14 a month for it. But that he indulged in all the hocus-pocus attributed to him by his neighbors he vigorously denied. Crystal gazing is an old profession and has been an honored one. Egyptians stared into a pool of ink, and Greeks into a mirror, the Aztecs into a quartz crystal, and Europeans into a sword blade or a glass of sherry, any translucent surface that made the eyes blur with long gazing. When Joseph Smith first began to use his seer or peep stone, he employed the folklore familiar to rural America. The details of his rituals and incantations are unimportant because they were commonplace, and Joseph gave up money digging when he was 21 for a profession far more exciting. When in later years Joseph Smith had become the revered prophet of thousands of Mormons, he began writing an official autobiography in which his account of the adolescent years differed surprisingly from his brief sketch he had written in 1834 in answer to his critics. Here was no apology, but the beginning of an epic. When he was 14 years old, he wrote he was troubled by religious revivals in the neighborhood and went into the woods to seek guidance of the Lord. It was the first time in my life that I had made such an attempt, for amidst all my anxieties I had never as yet made the attempt to pray vocally. I kneeled down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. I had scarcely done so, when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me, and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered over me, and it seemed to me for a time as if I were doomed to sudden destruction. But, exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me, and at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from an unseen world who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being, just as this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy which held me bound. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself so as to be able to speak, than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light which of all the sects was right, and which I should join. I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong, and the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight, that those professors were all corrupt, that they draw near unto me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. He again forbade me to join with any of them, and many other things he did say unto me, which I cannot write at this time. When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking up into heaven. Lesser visions than this were common in the folklore of the area. Elias Smith, Vermont's famous dissenting preacher, at the age of 16 had a strikingly similar experience in the woods near Woodstock, where he saw the Lamb upon Mount Zion, and a bright glory in the forest. John Samuel Thompson, who had taught in the Palmyra Academy in 1825, had seen Christ descend from the firmament in a glare of brightness exceeding the tenfold the brilliancy of the meridian sun, and had heard him say, "I commission you to go and tell mankind that I am come, and bid every man to shout victory." But Thompson had never described this as anything but a dream. Asa Wilde of Amsterdam, New York, had talked with the awful and glorious majesty of the great Jehovah, and had learned that every denomination of professing Christians had become extremely corrupt, that 2/3 of the world's inhabitants were about to be destroyed and the remainder ushered into the millennium. "Much more the Lord revealed," Wilde had said, "but forbids my relating it this way. I shall soon publish a cheap pamphlet, my religious experience and travel in the divine life." But his own vision, as described by Joseph Smith 18 years after the event, clearly dwarfed all these experiences. One would naturally expect the local press to have given it considerable publicity at the time it allegedly occurred, and Joseph's autobiography would indeed lead one to believe that his vision of God the Father and his Son had created a neighborhood sensation. I soon found, however, that my telling the story had excited a great deal of prejudice against me among professors of religion, and was the cause of great persecution, which continued to increase. And though I was an obscure boy, only between 14 and 15 years of age, and my circumstances in life such as to make a boy of no consequence to the world, yet men of high standing would take notice sufficient to excite the public mind against me, and create a bitter persecution, and this was common to all the sects, all united to persecute me. Oddly, however, the Palmyra newspapers, which in later years gave him plenty of unpleasant publicity, took no notice of Joseph's vision at the time it was supposed to have occurred. In fact, Dogberry insisted in the Palmyra Reflector on February 1, 1831, "It, however, appears quite certain that the prophet himself never made any serious pretensions to religion until his late pretended revelation, the discovery of the Book of Mormon." He noted on February 14th that Joseph's followers in Ohio were claiming he had seen God frequently and personally, and that commissions and papers were exhibited said to be signed by Christ himself. But he insisted on February 28, "It is well known that Joseph Smith never pretended to have any communion with angels until a long period after the pretended finding of his book." Joseph's first published autobiographical sketch of 1834, already noted, contained no whisper of an event that, if it had happened, would have been the most soul-shattering experience of his whole youth. But there are two manuscript versions of the vision between 1831 and the published account in Orson Pratt's Remarkable Visions in 1840, which indicate that it underwent a remarkable evolution in detail. In the earlier, which Joseph dictated in 1831 or 1832, he stated that, "In the 16th year of my age, the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord." By 1835, this had changed to a vision of two personages in a pillar of fire above his head, and many angels. In the published version, the personages had become God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ, and the angels had vanished. Joseph's age had changed to 14. Although Joseph's final dating of the beginning of his mission was fixed at 1820, there is evidence that his mother and brothers, Hiram and Samuel, apparently did not stop going to their Presbyterian church until September 1828. Lucy Smith, when writing to her brother in 1831 the full details of the Book of Mormon and the founding of the new church, said nothing about the first vision. The earliest published Mormon history, begun with Joseph's collaboration in 1834 by Oliver Cowdery, ignored it altogether, stating that the religious excitement in the Palmyra area occurred when he was 17, not 14. Cowdery described the Joseph's visionary life as beginning in September 1823 with the vision of an angel called Moroni, who is said to have directed Joseph to the discovery of hidden golden plates. Significantly, in later years, some of Joseph's close relatives confused the first vision with that of the angel Moroni. When Joseph began his autobiography in 1838, he was writing not of his own life, but of one who had already become the most celebrated prophet of the 19th century, and he was writing for his own people. Memories are always distorted by the wishes, thoughts, and, above all, the obligations of the moment. If something happened that spring morning in 1820, it passed totally unnoticed in Joseph's hometown, and apparently did not even fix itself in the minds of members of his own family. The awesome vision he described in later years was probably the elaboration of some half-remembered dream stimulated by the early revival excitement and reinforced by the rich folklore of visions circulating in his neighborhood. Or it may have been a sheer invention, created sometime after 1830 when the need arose for a magnificent tradition to cancel out the stories of his fortune-telling and money-digging. Dream images came easily to this youth, whose imagination was as untrammeled as the whole West. A few discerning citizens in Joseph's neighborhood were more amused at his followers than alarmed at the moral implications of his money-digging. One native, in writing his impressions of the boy in later years, recognized certain positive talents. Joseph had a little ambition and some very laudable aspirations. The mother's intellect shone out in him feebly, especially when he used to help us solve some portentous questions of moral or political ethics in our juvenile debating club, which we moved down to the old red schoolhouse on Durfee Street to get rid of the critics that used to drop in on us in the village. And subsequently, after watching a spark of Methodism in the camp meeting away down in the woods on the Vienna Road, he was a very passable exhorter in the evening meetings. This is one of two non-Mormon accounts which indicate that Joseph Smith, for all his enthusiasm for necromancy, was not immune to the religious excitement that periodically swept through Palmyra. His mother wrote that from the first he flatly refused to attend the camp meeting, saying, "I can take my Bible and go into the woods and learn more in 2 hours than you can learn at a meeting in 2 years, if you should go all the time." But it is clear that he was keenly alert to the theological differences dividing the sects and was genuinely interested in the controversies. Although contemptuous of sectarianism, he liked preaching because it gave him an audience, and this was an essential to Joseph as food. Daniel Hendricks, who helped set type for the Book of Mormon, once wrote that Joseph had a jovial, easy, don't-care way about him that made him a lot of warm friends. He was a good talker, and would have made a fine stump speaker if he had the training. He was known among the young men I associated with as a romancer of the first water. I never knew so ignorant a man as Joe was to have such a fertile imagination. He could never tell a common occurrence in his daily life without embellishing the story with his imagination. Yet, I remember that he was grieved one day when old Parson Reed told Joe that he was going to hell for his lying habits. Joseph himself spoke frequently of his native cheery temperament, and it is evident that from an early age he was a friendly, entertaining youth who delighted in performing before his friends. At 17 he was lank and powerful, 6 feet tall and moderately handsome. His hair, turning from tow-colored to light brown, swept back luxuriantly from his forehead. Even at his age there was something compelling in his bearing, and older men listened to his stories half doubting, half respectful. He never lacked a following. His imagination spilled over like a spring freshet. When he stared into his crystal and saw gold in every odd-shaped hill, he was escaping from the drudgery of farm labor into a glorious opulence. Had he been able to continue his schooling, subjecting his plastic fancy and tremendous dramatic talent to discipline and molding, his life might never have taken the exotic turn it did. His mind was agile and eager, and disciplined study might have caused his creative talents to turn in a more conventionally profitable direction. Stephen A. Douglas, also a great natural leader, was in the same years attending the Canandaigua Academy, some 9 miles south, and it was there that he took measure of his own vigorous talents and proceeded to put them to use. The two probably did not meet in their youth, but when their paths crossed years later in Illinois, the two men had become, each in his own fashion, the most celebrated figures on the Mississippi frontier. But whether Joseph's ebullient spirits could ever have been canalized by any discipline is an open question. He had only limited formal schooling after leaving New England, and since he never gained a true perspective of his own gifts, he probably was inclined to regard them as more abnormal or supernatural than they actually were. What was really an extraordinary capacity for fantasy, with which proper training might even have turned him to novel writing, was looked upon by himself and his followers as genuine second sight, and by the more pious townspeople as outrageous lying. When Joseph was 18, his eldest brother Alvin died in sudden and dreadful agony from what his mother described as an overdose of calomel described by a physician to cure a stomach disorder. Lucy Smith in her narrative mentioned the death briefly and almost philosophically, for 20 years had passed to mitigate her sorrow, but she omitted altogether its curious sequel. Alvin had been no churchgoer, and the minister who preached his funeral sermon intimated very strongly that he had gone to hell. The family's rage against the parson had barely cooled when they heard a rumor that Alvin's body had been exhumed and dissected, fearing it to be true. The elder Smith uncovered the grave on September 25, 1824, and inspected the corpse. On September 29, and for 1 week succeeding, he published the following paid advertisement in the Wayne Sentinel. To the public. Whereas reports have been industriously put in circulation that my son Alvin has been removed from the place of his interment and dissected, which reports every person possessed of human sensibility must know are peculiarly calculated to harrow up the mind of a parent and deeply wound the feelings of relations, I, with some of my neighbors this morning, repaired to the grave, and removing the earth, found the body, which had not been disturbed. This method is taken for the purpose of satisfying the minds of those who have put it in the circulation, that it is earnestly requested that they would desist therefrom, and that it is believed by some that they have been stimulated more by a desire to injure the reputation of certain persons than by a philanthropy for the peace and welfare of myself and friends. Signed, Joseph Smith, Palmyra, September 25, 1824. It is difficult to explain this cruel practical joke as other than someone's attempt to ridicule the digging activities of the Smith family, which had never been seriously interrupted. In fact, by the time he was 19, young Joseph Smith was beginning to acquire a reputation for being a necromancer of exceptional talent, who numbered even his father and brother Hiram among his followers. His mother wrote that Josiah Stoll came all the way from Pennsylvania to see her son, on account of having heard that he possessed certain keys by which he could discern things invisible to the natural eye. Stoll, an elderly farmer from South Bainbridge, now Afton, New York, had come north to visit relatives and had met Joseph in Palmyra. Simpson Stoll begged him to display his magic talents before the old man, and Joseph, being Simpson's friend, obliged by describing in detail the Stoll house and outhouses in South Bainbridge. Stoll was so impressed that he begged the youth to go south with him and looked for a lost silver mine said to have been worked by the Spaniards in the Susquehanna Valley. He would pay him, he said, $14 a month and board him free. Harvest was over, and the prospect of seeing new country probably attracted Joseph as much as the cash salary. Always loyal to his family, he insisted that his father be included in the arrangement, and they set forth with Stoll for the south. They stopped in the Allegheny foothills, staying for a time in Harmony, Pennsylvania, on the banks of the romantic Susquehanna. Here they boarded with a big, bearish Vermonter named Isaac Hale. Their host, a famous hunter, spent most of his time in the forests, leaving his wife and daughters to look after the gardens and cows. Joseph was at once attracted to the 21-year-old Emma, a dark, serious-faced girl with great, luminous hazel eyes. She was so quiet, almost to taciturnity, with an unapproachable air to which Joseph, who at 20 was already accounted a great favorite with the ladies, responded with more than casual attentiveness. In the beginning, Isaac Hale helped subsidize Stoll's expeditions into the mountains, but with the first failures he was quickly disillusioned and shortly became contemptuous. 9 years later he wrote of Joseph, who had by then become his son-in-law. His appearance at this time was that of a careless young man, not very well educated, and very saucy and insolent to his father. Young Smith gave the money-diggers great encouragement at first, but when they arrived in digging to near the place where he had stated an immense treasure would be found, he said the enchantment was so powerful that he could not see. They then became discouraged, and soon after dispersed. This took place about the 17th of November, 1825. Eventually, Joseph's father went back to Palmyra, but the youth remained on the farm of Josiah Stoll, who seems never to have lost faith in the supernatural talents of his protege. Joseph worked on the farm, attended school in the winter, and spent his leisure hunting for treasure and riding into Pennsylvania to see Emma Hale. In March 1826, Joseph's magic arts for the first time brought him into serious trouble. One of Stoll's neighbors, Peter Bridgman, swore out a warrant for the youth's arrest on the charge of being a disorderly person and an impostor. On the witness stand, Joseph denied that he had spent all his time looking for mines and insisted that for the most part he worked on Stoll's farm and went to school. He admitted, however, that he had a certain stone, which he had occasionally looked at to determine where certain treasures hidden in the bowels of the earth were, that he professed to tell in this manner where gold mines were a distance underground, and he looked for Mr. Stoll several times, and informed him where he could find those treasures, and Mr. Stoll had been engaged in digging for them, that at Palmyra he pretended to tell, by looking at the stone, where coined money was buried in Pennsylvania, and while at Palmyra he had frequently ascertained in that way where lost property was, of various kinds, that he had occasionally been in the habit of looking through this stone to find lost property for 3 years, but of late had pretty much given it up on account of its injuring his health, especially his eyes, made them sore, that he did not solicit business of this kind, and had always rather declined having anything to do with this business. Stoll defended Joseph with great vigor, insisting that he positively knew the latter could see valuable treasures through the stone. Once the youth had told him to dig up the roots of an old stump, promising that he would find a chest of money and a tail feather. At a depth of 5 feet, he had uncovered the tail feather, only to discover that the money had moved down. His testimony, however well-intentioned, did the prisoner more harm than good. Stoll's relative attacked Joseph bitterly, and the court pronounced him guilty, though what sentence was finally passed on the record does not say. Oliver Cowdery's history, the only Mormon account that has ever mentioned this trial, denied that Joseph had been found guilty. Some very officious person, Cowdery wrote, complained of him as an orderly person, and brought before him the authorities of the county, but there being no cause for action, he was honorably acquitted. It would seem that this trial, and the first in a long series of crises in his life, shocked Joseph into a sense of the futility of his avocation, for he now gave up his money digging altogether, although he retained his peepstone and some of the psychological artifices of the rural diviner. It may be that this renunciation came in part from disillusionment with his own magic. Most bucolic scryers are ignorant, superstitious folk who believe profoundly in their mineral rods and rabbit's feet. Professional magicians, on the other hand, are not naive. The great anthropologist Sir James Frazer sagely pointed out that in primitive tribes the intelligent novitiate studying to be a medicine man is likely to see through the fallacies that impress duller wits. The sorcerer who believes in his own extravagant pretensions is much more likely to be cut short in his career than the deliberate impostor, and the ablest are those who plan and practice their trickery. Where the honest wizard is taken aback when his charms fail conspicuously, the deliberate deceiver always has an excuse. Certainly Joseph's mentor, the conjurer Walters, belonged to the latter class. It is clear that Joseph had no desire to make up a life profession of emulating Walters. Perhaps he gave up the trickery and artifice just when their hollowness became most evident to him. Perhaps his renunciation was due entirely to Emma Hale. But he could not cast off his unbridled fancy and love of theatricalism, which had attracted him to necromancy in the first place. After the trial he remained for some months with Stoll, for he was now very much in love and reluctant to return to Palmyra without taking with him Emma as his wife. But Isaac Hale, holding Joseph to be a cheap impostor, thundered a refusal when he asked for her hand and drove him out of the house. Joseph now made clandestine visits whenever Hale went hunting and begged the girl to run away with him. Skeptical, unsure of him, and concerned over their future, she hesitated. But there were only about 200 people in Harmony, and she scorned the scattering of eligible men in the village. Now approaching 23, she may have felt herself threatened with spinsterhood. Moreover, Joseph had all the ardor of a youth of 21, but none of the usual inarticulateness. She was wildly in love with him. He was big, powerful, and by ordinary standards very handsome, except for his nose, which was aquiline and prominent. His large blue eyes were fringed by fantastically long lashes, which made his gaze seem veiled and slightly mysterious. Emma was probably quick to notice what many of his followers later believed had a supernatural cause, that when he was speaking with intense feeling, the blood drained from his face, leaving a frightening, almost luminous pallor. However she may have disapproved of his money-digging, she must have had faith in his insight into mysteries that common folk could not fathom. She needed no one to tell her that here was no ordinary man. Stoll, who was fond of the couple and anxious to further their marriage, arranged for Emma to meet Joseph at his home in South Bainbridge. On January 18, 1827, they were secretly married in the home of Squire Tarble. After the ceremony, they departed for Manchester to live with Joseph's parents. 8 months later, they returned to Harmony to brave the wrath of Isaac Hale and to secure some furniture and livestock that Emma owned in her own name. Since Joseph had no wagon, he hired Peter Ingersoll to drive them the distance, and it is to him what we are indebted for a description of the meeting. Hale met the couple in a flood of tears. "You have stolen my daughter and married her," he cried. "I had much rather have followed her to the grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see it in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." Joseph wept, Ingersoll said, and acknowledged he could not see in a stone now never could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. Somewhat conciliated, Hale told Joseph that if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living, he would help him get into business, and to this Joseph agreed. But there was a great impatience in this youth which made grubbing in the soil a hateful labor. In truth, he was through the profession. In truth, he was through with money digging, but if he had become disillusioned with the profession, he had retained a superb faith in himself. In the next 5 years, Joseph climbed up out of the world of magic into the world of religion. He was transformed from a lowly necromancer into a prophet, surrounded no longer merely by a clientele, but by an enthusiastic following with common purposes and ideals.